Let's turn our attention back to actually consuming promises. That's because since ES 2017, there's now an even better and easier way to consume promises, which is called Async Await. So let me show you how it works. So we start by creating a special kind of function, which is an async function. So let me call it where am I and so function. But for now we pass the country again to make it simple at the beginning. But as I was saying, we don't need to make this a special kind of function, which is an async function. And we do this by simply adding async here in front of the function. And so this function is now an asynchronous function. So a function that will basically keep running in the background while they're performing the code that inside of it. Then when this function is done, it automatically returns a promise. For now, what's important is that inside an async function, we can have one or more await statements. So await, and then here we need a promise, and so we can use the promise to return for the fetch function. And so let's now use the API to search for a country basically. So this is the URL I want to use, and so here let's now pass in the country again. So again here we will return a promise, and so in an async function like this one, we can use the await keyword to basically await for the result of this promise. So basically the await will stop code execution at this point of the function until the promise is fulfilled, and so until the data has been fetched in this case. But now after that explanation, you might think, isn't stop the code blocking the execution? Well, that's a really good question, but the answer is actually no in this case, because stopping execution and the extend function, which is what we have here, is actually not a problem, because this function is running asynchronously in the background, and so therefore it is not blocking the main thread of the execution. So it's not blocking the call stack, and in fact that's what's so special about Async Await. So it's the fact that it makes our code look like a regular synchronous code while behind the scenes. In fact, everything is an asynchronous. But anyway, as soon as this promise here is resolved, then the value of the whole way expression that we have here is going to be the result value of the promise. And so we can simply store that into a variable. So let's call it REST4 response, and then here we can take a look at that response. And just to show you that this function is actually asynchronous. So let's log something to the console before we call it. So just first, because this should be printed first. And then we actually call function first. Where am I with Spain? But if I do this, this console log first will be displayed first. Because again, this is a async function. And so once function is called, it is then loaded off to the background. And so this fetch here will be running in the background without blocking or main thread. And so the code will move on to next line, which is then this console dollar first. And so indeed we got the first printer first, and then we got the response. But this time we got this response and this really nice and elegant way. So you see here that by using the async await or asynchronous code here, we can simply await until the value of the promise is returned basically, and then just assign that value to a variable. And that is something that was impossible before. This looks now like a normal synchronous code where we simply assign values to a variable. That makes it so much easier and more clean. Now before we start using async await over the place, we need to first understand that async await is in fact simply synthetic sugar over the then method and promises. So of course behind the scenes we are still using promises. We are simply using a different way of consuming than here in this case. But what we have here, this is exactly the same as doing it the old way basically. Using then and then rest and then console log rest, like what we did here. So this is exactly the same. Let's put that here. So now that we know how async await works, it's time to actually recreate where am I function. So first of all, we need to get the JSON out of this response. And so remember on the response, we need to call JSON. And remember that it returns a new promise. And so previously we will have to return this promise and then change another then handler. But now this becomes so much easier. All we have to do is again await this. And then we can store the results directly into the data variable that we have been using before. So here it is. So here is the same data as before. And so now all we need to do is to render it. So render country and data at position 0. That's our data, so render it to the page here. And all without the chaining of promises like we had before. So this is very elegant. One more time, simply be able to essentially store the fulfill promise value immediately into a variable without having to mess with the corporate functions now.